This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian, and before I get started, I want to welcome all my new listeners who heard my latest story on 99% Invisible and decided to wander over and say hello. I'm thrilled to have you here. I've got a pretty extensive archive of almost 90 past episodes documenting everything from my visit to Chernobyl to my drive across Iran as an American tourist to my participation in an ayahuasca ceremony in Peru, so I encourage you to go back and dive in. And actually, the best place to start would probably be at the very beginning with my first episode on my first season, where I covered an 11,000-mile road trip I took from the UK to Mongolia in a ridiculously tiny car that constantly broke down along the way. I've met several people recently who said they discovered my podcast, started listening to me telling the story of that journey, and then got hooked and ended up binging the whole thing. So if you're looking for your next bingeable series, you might want to check it out. Okay, so this is a bonus companion episode that's meant to go along with the other episode I just released about Freetown, Christiania. If you haven't heard that yet, I suggest you press pause now and go listen to that first in order for this to make sense. This was a really fascinating story to document, and in the process of my reporting, I captured many hours of interviews that didn't make it into the final story, so I wanted to share some of my favorite highlights with all of you here. As you'll recall, my documentary started with this guy named John Bang Carlson, who just graduated from high school in rural Denmark. And the backstory we didn't have time to include was that he'd come of age in the late 1960s, when, of course, the Vietnam War was going on, and there were these activist causes and protest movements spreading among young people, not just in the United States, but around the world. And John felt a bit stifled in his tiny little town. You know, he had bigger hopes and dreams, including a desire to go to film school, so he wanted to get out. And if you're in Denmark, the most logical place to go, of course, is the capital city of Copenhagen. So John shows up there sometime around 1970 or 71, and he told me things were kind of rough.
It was a gigantic metropolis by then, but it actually was a rather kind of falling apart.
Like in a lot of places around that time, there'd been this urban flight, so large numbers of people had moved out to the suburbs, which meant Copenhagen's economy was kind of struggling. There were these boarded-up buildings that the former residents had left behind, which most folks saw as urban blight, but kids like John, who were in this younger generation, viewed this differently. I mean, they pretty much saw this as a perfect opportunity to take things over and remake them how they wanted. And the biggest symbol of that opportunity was this enormous abandoned military base you heard about that was right across the harbor from the city's downtown. So John decides to head over there one evening and see it for himself. And there was this almost cinematic scene he described to me of what it was like.
When I first went over that wall, you know, all those kind of very military buildings, and it was a lot of darkness, a lot of broken windows, because, of course, a lot of kids went in there and broke the windows like kids do, right? When nobody looks after it, right? But then you went around, and suddenly you saw up there on the fourth floor, there was one little window with light in, with a candle in, and you saw a face up there. It could be an old man, it could be a young woman. And then you went on, and then suddenly there was another little window in the darkness where maybe two people were playing guitar or doing something. And then maybe further on the ground floor, some guy might be repairing the windows or putting in new glass or something like that. Suddenly this corpse of a military building was beginning to resurrect, but resurrect as something which was in total disaccord with what it originally was meant to be.
John told me he'd just broken up with his girlfriend at the time, so he was feeling pretty sad. At one point, as he's wandering around, he comes to a lake where he sees the moon's reflection in the water, and he remembered thinking that even the moon looked depressed. Anyway, he didn't know anyone, he didn't have anywhere to eat or sleep, so eventually he knocks on a random door.
And this guy opened the door and he said, hey, okay, we're just making food, come in, have some food. And I came in there, it turned out there were like 12 guys living there and one woman, right? But it was like all have arrived like me.
John described them as broken souls who all seemed to be searching for something just like he was. After dinner, they let him crash on a bunk bed, and when he wakes up the next morning, breakfast is waiting for him. And he has this realization, like, this is it. I found this really magical place, and this seems like heaven. So John decides to stay. He moves in with the other squatters, and life is rough at first. But to him, it's totally worth it. because, he'd come from this kind of small-minded place out in the country where he always felt like he didn't quite fit in. But now, finally, it seemed like he'd found his people.
I had some strange thoughts that nobody could maybe use for anything in their worlds, right? But when I came out there, suddenly some of my babblings, some of my wild ideas, suddenly they kind of caught fire in somebody else's mind, like this other mind's wild babbling caught fire in my mind.
So these kids are all living there now in this sort of urban wilderness, and they use every opportunity they get to take advantage of their newfound freedoms. John told me so many amazing stories of some of the craziness that went on there in those early days, but I unfortunately only had time to include a few of them in my original story that ran on 99% Invisible, so I wanted to share some more of them now. First of all, there were stories about how from the very beginning, Christiania was this place that sort of oozed art and creativity at every turn.
There was this woman who was also, funny enough, American, She moved into a huge former military where they made ammunition. It's now torn down. But she lived in there, and she had, in the middle of this gigantic factory room, she had her canvas standing in the middle, and then she was driving around on a motorbike and with a brush, and then he kind of attacked the painting on motorbike, right? Where could you do that otherwise?
Then there were stories John told about all these colorful characters he met in the community.
There lived this guy who had some problems with women, He liked to be like a Viking, even though he was not very big, but he made himself very big, and he got this big horse. And then we had problems with him because he had this idea that Vikings, they could go on a horse, and if they saw a beautiful woman, they could just put his arm around her, put her up on the horse and take her back home and make love with her, right? And of course, that wasn't really what he should do, so we had to kind of interfere with this guy. Then we had a very big lake in the middle of this rather big area, and there was a beautiful two swans, a man and a woman, and it meant a lot for us. It was called Christiania's Ocean, right? And this guy suddenly one day, to his horror, he saw there was 3 swans. And of course, that's wrong, Somebody was competing, This was too dangerous, right? So he took his gun, and he went down to the lake, and he shot the intruder. Unfortunately, he shot the woman, right? So now there was only 2 males left, right? And that's also kind of a very typical Christiania story, right? This is all kind of a cartoonish, romantic approach to life, which was very entertaining and, of course, sometimes very exhausting, right?
One of the fascinating things about Christiania is its unique architecture. The first wave of squatters occupied the former military barracks, but then they ran out of space and more people kept arriving. So the new folks started building homes on vacant land out of basically whatever material they could salvage. John told me about this one guy he remembered who found a bunch of old doors and took them to a field.
And he built a totally square house made of doors. And then he moved in there. He played a clarinet or something like that, and he played it very sentimentally, like a lot of pain in that music instrument, right? And you passed him every day and heard him and never saw him coming out. And then sometimes you saw people who wanted to talk to him or hear how he was doing. And of course they couldn't figure out what door to knock on because there were 45 possibilities to get in. And I never saw him open any of the doors until one day he was suddenly gone.
So, as you could see, John was a really great storyteller. And you'll also recall this other Christiania resident who was in my documentary, Ole Luke Anderson, who actually serves as the community's archivist.
Basically, Christiania is a place where you can have a very communal feeling, that you are part of a bigger group and you have a common purpose.
I asked Ole what it was like living there, and he had this really great quote that I think perfectly captures life in the community with its odd assortment of hippies, anarchists, visionaries, and other strong-willed individuals.
There was an English photographer who in the 70s made a book about Christiania, and he put it this way, that he had met the most beautiful, idealistic people he had met in his life, and he had met the biggest assholes. And then he said, what's typical for Christiania is that the limit has been expanded in both directions.
Anyway, despite their differences, all these people somehow seemed to more or less get along as the community continued to grow. Meanwhile, people outside Christiania were looking on, not entirely sure what to make of it. The Danish government goes back and forth in their approach. First, they're like, we don't really have any use for this old military base anymore. We'll just let these hippies have their fun. They'll probably get tired and leave after a while. Then a few years goes by and the squatters are still there. So the government changes its mind. They win a court case to kick everyone out. But by that point, Christiania had gotten so big and attracted so much popular support in Danish society that the country's parliament says, nah, you could stay. John told me he had his own theories about why they never acted to evict everyone.
I think they knew that it was a valve for the society. It had a function within the society. And they knew that cleaning up the place would be at an enormous cost, human-wise and also economically. And it could create some situations that could have some dead bodies on the floor, right? And they didn't want that to happen.
So even though the Danish government still owned all the land, there was sort of this collective understanding that Christiania wasn't going anywhere. And just to give you a sense of how well established the community became, it created its own flag, it minted its own coins that were used at local businesses, and it even adopted an unofficial protest anthem. I'm told the lyrics translate to something like, "You can't kill us, we are part of you." So anyway, as time went on, Christiania managed to not just survive, but even thrive. It's now been there for more than 50 years, and it's actually become one of Copenhagen's biggest tourist attractions, visited by over 1 million people each year. If you go there, it sort of feels like an amusement park for adults. It's really colorful and vibrant, and many of the buildings are covered with murals and street art. There are coffee shops, vegetarian restaurants, art galleries, and music venues, as well as quirky local businesses like a women-owned blacksmith shop, a brewery where they make beer out of hemp, and a bicycle factory where they build these famous cargo bikes that they export all over Europe. Okay, so we've come this far. I suppose it's time now to talk about the enormous elephant in the room, which is, of course, Pusher Street. And to set the scene, I should probably explain that a lot of people have this inaccurate perception that Europe is pretty liberal with its drug laws. I mean, there are certain countries like the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal that have decriminalized cannabis, but as I learned in my reporting, Scandinavia, including Denmark, has historically had pretty tough anti-drug laws on the books. And when you have something that's illegal, that of course opens the door to an underground criminal market. So you had this place called Pusher Street, which some people called Denmark's most notorious street. It earned quite a reputation, especially among TikTokers and YouTubers who were visiting for the first time.
We went for a walk to Pusher Street, which is the street of the dealers where they sell all the marijuana.
They sell hash. Dope! Marijuana.
There was this street that we walked down called Pusher Street, and they were just openly selling weed just from these little kiosks. It was like nothing we had ever seen before. We just really didn't know what to think of it.
Literally, I have never ever even heard of such a place in my whole entire life.
You have to check it out, right? It's so cool. A lawless enclave. Are you excited?
Yeah.
So this brings us to this other guy who I interviewed for my story, Marios Orozco. He's an artist, and nowadays he runs his gallery in Christiania where he sells his brightly colored paintings of scenes from around the community. But back in the day, he was a dealer on Pusher Street, and there's a fascinating story of how he ended up there. Marios grew up in Greece and then Boston, and he started selling pot when he was like 14 or 15 years old. But then a bunch of people he knew started getting busted and sent to prison. So he was understandably really excited when he heard about this place called Christiania.
I had a couple of friends who had been here, and they told me about it. And they were like, man, this place is, it's just people, long hair, and it's a really cool place. And people sell hash openly. And I thought, well, that sounds like freedom to me.
So in 1981, when he turns 19, Marios ends up moving there, as he put it, to escape Reagan's war on drugs. When he first shows up, he meets this guy everyone calls Pancake Ray because he had a little crepe stand out there on Pusher Street. Pancake Ray lets Marios crash on his couch, and Marios promptly goes out and purchases a scale, which he then uses to go into business on Pusher Street. Over time, he works his way up the hierarchy until he eventually becomes one of the main suppliers selling to all the other dealers. In fact, he called himself a connoisseur of hash, and he said he earned a reputation for selling a high-quality product at a fair price. The way Marios described things to me, those were kind of the golden days. You know, pretty much everyone on Pusher Street knew each other at the time and got along pretty well. In fact, of all the places Marios had ever lived, he told me this was the first that ever truly felt to him like home.
We had really a community on Pusher Street, which was completely unlike anything I'd experienced in the States. I mean, we were kids in the park selling weed and whatever, but it wasn't like the feeling that was here.
But while the residents of Christiania were fine with an open-air cannabis market operating in their neighborhood, the Danish authorities weren't exactly thrilled with this idea, so they'd regularly send police to conduct raids and arrest people. And if you go on YouTube, you'll find videos of lots of these raids. Marios told me folks were used to this, though, and it just sort of came with the territory.
Usually I would start like 9 o'clock in the morning and then to like 7. Cops usually came around 7, 8 o'clock, so that was a good time to stop. The cops would just bust in. They didn't need a search warrant or anything because everything was considered military area. I've been robbed by cops. Cops would, break into your house, search it, and say, okay, we didn't find anything. They leave, and then you realize your money's gone. That's happened several times.
For a bunch of years, it was like a cat and mouse game, with the police doing their raids and demolishing the pushers' stands, and then the pushers would just build them up again and go back to business as normal. It was sort of like the two sides had reached a stalemate. But then the Danish government decided to crack down more on the cannabis trade, which led to biker gangs like the Hells Angels eventually taking over the market, and things started to get really violent as they were fighting against each other for turf.
There's nowhere in the world where you have like 5 gangs standing next to each other on such a small area and nothing is happening.
And I should explain that Denmark is generally a really safe country with low crime rates. So under normal circumstances, shootings and stabbings are pretty rare. But suddenly you had this one particular street in Copenhagen where this has become a regular occurrence. In the course of making this story, I spoke to this guy, David Sostel, who's a criminologist and an associate professor of social anthropology at Lund University in Sweden.
Let me use my own sort of anecdotal experience of having sort of been a guy who's been hanging out at Christiania and Pusher Street every now and then the last 20 years. When I first visited Christiania, it was pretty relaxed. You could sit on the moat, smoke a joint if you wanted to. You could buy beer. There were concerts. If you look at the last 50 years of Pusher Street, it has definitely gone from being a very sort of relaxed, people on the smile on the faces, to being like 50 or 100 meters small, straight of masked people, nervous faces, shouting, sort of conflict waiting to happen.
So the situation got pretty bad, which kind of left the residents of Christiania in a quandary. They had their consensus decision-making process, which was sort of this tool in their toolbox that was supposed to help them forge compromises and reach near unanimity when figuring out how to handle difficult and controversial issues. But as I found out, that didn't quite live up to its promises. Basically, this whole governing by consensus thing that Christiania was founded on sounds great in theory, but as John Bang Carlson had told me, there were problems that emerged even way back in the earliest days.
The way they reached consensus was by some of the guys totally wearing all the other guys out, right? By just going on and on and on and on and on. And of course, those guys who could do that, they didn't have a work to go to attend to next morning, right?
So, as you heard in my documentary, the contingent of Christiania residents who wanted to close Pusher Street ended up winning out, which really worried folks like Marios, because he viewed this as part of a slippery slope where everything that drew him to the community in the first place was being watered down.
A lot of these younger people, they live in Christiania. They just want a normal life. They want, to raise their kids in normal circumstances, but we're not normal. If we're normal, we'll just be like outside, and we can't call ourselves Christiania anymore. Christiania is a place where we went because we weren't normal. We escaped to Christiania. It was amazing. When I came to Christiania, I was amongst my own type of people, which were freaks. We were fucking freaks. We were crazy. We were different. We had long hair. People point at us when we walked down the street in Copenhagen. But in Christiania, nobody gave a shit. We were all the same. Crazy.
As I'm recording this, it's been about 6 months since Pusher Street was closed. I've continued following the news out of Christiania, and the gangs have thankfully stayed away. The violence now seems to be a thing of the past, but it's a complicated story, because without the foot traffic that Pusher Street attracted, many nearby businesses are now struggling to stay open. The future of the area remains uncertain, but residents are considering several plans, including building playgrounds, gardens, cafes, and maybe a museum where the drug market once stood. So there's a lot that's still up in the air. I've told people about this story I was working on, and several of them have asked me what I think will happen to Christiania. You know, between the closing of the drug market and the plans to build affordable housing, is this the beginning of the end for the community, as Marios fears? Or will Christiania figure out a way to adapt and evolve so it lasts another 50 years? I honestly don't know, but I will say that when John and the other young kids first crawled over the walls of that military base way back in 1971, they never would have imagined that this community they founded would still be there and that we'd still be talking about it over half a century later. Christiania has already faced and managed to overcome some pretty big headwinds in its history, so I'll be really curious to continue watching it from afar and see how the residents use their creativity and ingenuity to find solutions for whatever the next challenge is that comes their way. Thanks so much for listening to this extended bonus episode. I hope you enjoyed it, along with the documentary I produced. As always, if you have any thoughts, comments, feedback, or story suggestions, you could write to me at info@farfromhomepodcast.org. I just make these podcasts and release them out into the ether, so I'm always thrilled to hear from real-life listeners. I read every single message I get, and I usually respond, so please do drop me a line, because I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this show, please help spread the word about Far From Home by posting something about it on social media or texting or emailing a friend. You could follow me at Far From Home Podcast on Facebook, as well as on Instagram, where I often post photos and videos from my travels. In fact, if you go there now, you could see some recent Instagram stories I posted from New Zealand, where I'm currently working remotely, and it's such a beautiful place. Okay, that's enough for me. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back in a few weeks.